बात करनी मुझे मुश्किल कभी ऐसी तो ना थी, जैसी है तेरी महफिल कभी ऐसी तो ना थी. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm joined by my comrades, Dr. Amit Ranjan and Dr. Nasruddin Khan. Nasir has joined us all the way from Silchar in Assam, where he teaches, and he's a historian. Uh, he's a professional historian, I must add, because nowadays there are many kinds of historians. So Nasir is going to talk about something very serious, but hopefully in an extremely accessible grammar. And we would like to address how prisons were in the past, how prisons were born in the 19th century, how the idea of prisons emerged since the Middle Ages, especially after Jeremy Bentham's conception of the idea of the Panopticon, and what was the social role that prisons played in our imagination. So I'm guessing we would hear a lot about the Indian context mainly, but also about certain other global contexts, and even about prisons in the modern era. And I'm also joined, as in the previous episode, by Amit Ranjan. So Amit will also have very insightful remarks on the history of prisons. I give it over to Nasir. Nasir, what do you have for us today?
Uh, Thank you, Arup. Hello, Arup. Hello, Amit. So it's nice to be
Hello,
here with
Khan sir.
you,
Hello,
all three of
Professor
you again.
Chatterjee. Hello, Khan sir. How are you?
Yes, I'm fine. Thanks. So anyway, so the idea was uh, in the last podcast, your first podcast, I heard two, three words. So I was very intrigued by those words. Like, for example, there was this word called phrenology, and the other was eugenics. Right. So usually when we talk about crime, criminology, when we talk about histories of crime, narratives of crime, then we usually talk about race, we usually talk about social Darwinism. And then in the larger 19th century thing, when we think of prison, then we not only see prisons as spaces of control, but rather more than spaces of control. So to talk about prisons. My interest in prison came from my father's involvement with Tihar Jail. He was in paramilitary, so he was posted in Tihar Jail. So he used to tell me about how torture used to happen. So it fascinated me all the time. It was only when I started reading Foucault during my PG days that when I started reading Discipline and Punish, that I got to know about prisons, to understand prisons. And there are other few books. Anyway, we won't go deep into histories. So I believe, like my thing was to start with Jeremy Bentham. Maybe we can discuss Jeremy Bentham a little bit and his Panopticon writings in particular. So the thing was like how prison emerges as a space in the 19th century, and especially in the context of Britain and India, what we see is that it develops from simply a barrack system to a more refined cellular jail kind of system. So how does it happen? So one of the leading role was played by Jeremy Bentham, I think. What do you think, Amit?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Jeremy Bentham is seminal to a discussion of prisons and to all modern surveillance systems where you are seen by nobody, but you are always seen. So the design of the Panopticon is a tower with cells all around it. So even if somebody is not sitting, it sorts of acts as a deterrent. The prisoners will always think that big watching them. So so of course, technology has multiplied manifold since then, textually and technologically as well. But the core philosophy of surveillance remains the same. Even now, you have a lot of empty shells for CCTVs, and there are warnings that you're under surveillance of CCTV, which probably means that there is no CCTV over there, but you should be afraid that somebody is watching you.
I
So
think the
that
idea was, yeah, Karen.
so that's the core idea that to create instill fear in the prisoners and now society at large that you're being watched.
I believe, Amit, it was, yes, you're right. It was also a kind of uncertainty. And this uncertainty, in a way, produces self-regulation. So the idea was like prisoners were always like visible, but they were never certain when exactly are they being watched, right? But
Exactly.
they had this idea that they were being watched. So it was perhaps a kind of self-regulation, I believe.
Yeah, to induce
And it's,
what
yeah.
Althusser calls interpellation in the 1980s, that it's willing for feature of your agency in that matter.
And it is with Foucault that we see that, this surveillance kind of thing becomes power. It is like his reinterpretation of Panopticon in Discipline and Punish, wherein Panopticon becomes a metaphor for the modern society as a whole. And individual becomes, docile bodies. So, which I seriously doubt, like when I think of spaces like Cellular Jail in India, I like Cellular Jail was one experiment, as we all know, of like this Kala Pani thing. So it was an experiment of transportation, essentially. So prisoners were transported from the Indian prisons. Particularly, it happened in the 18th century. That's why the long 19th century. So and then finally, after 1857, that we see most of the prisoners from the various prisons. 1857, these mutineers, these prisoners were being transported to Andamans. So in the process, what we see is during this transportation process, we see that they were initially put in barracks. It is only with the turn of the 20th century, 1905, 1906, that we see that cellular jail was built. So where we see watchtower in between and then flanks of cells, individual cells. So they don't become docile bodies. What I think and what I've been arguing through my work is that individuals do not become docile bodies in prisons like cellular jail, but there are ways of resisting. Even though the colonial power was very mighty, there were various ways of resisting to bring in James Scott, everyday kinds of resistance, for example. So they were not mere docile bodies, I believe. They were not only disciplining themselves, but they were also resisting in their own way. So what do you think, Arup?
My knowledge regarding prisons is somewhat confined to the cellular jail. In fact, the history of the prehistory of the cellular jail, the Andamans were being, to my knowledge, cultivated as a penal colony since the late 18th century, and I think
Yes. Yes.
they were successful only in the latter half of the 19th century. And it was also doubling up the penal colony. Convict colony would be an overstatement, but the penal colony was doubling up as a site of anthropology. I am, surely this is something that is way beyond my wheelbarrow. But at the same time, I find it very interesting how a penal settlement can double up for other scientific or other, governmental purposes. So anthropology becomes a part of the colonial state and collecting information, anthropological information about the Andamanese becomes, a kind of a day job for the people of the Andaman jail. Okay, and this is also the time when the British are very keen. Late 19th century is a time when the British are very keen on driving a narrative that the Andamanese are very lethal people. They use poisoned arrows and they have other kinds of supernatural tricks, which are, by the way, very lethal for colonial forces. Now, all that is proven to be absolutely false. And you mentioned docile bodies taking from Michel Foucault, but the Andamanese are revealed to be literally docile people. So I wanted to ask you, rather than making any insights, I simply wanted to understand from you, is there any knowledge that you can share regarding how the Panopticon can facilitate institutions other than the jail. So the Panopticon is mainly used to facilitate an imprisonment facility. It is also today in the 21st century, it also is used for surveillance capitalism, to use Shoshana Zuboff's phrase. But in your knowledge, is there any parallel to the Andaman experiment, where a jail doubles up as a quasi-scientific or an anthropological institution?
Yes, definitely. Like, sorry, like recently I've been working on asylums, right? So what we see in asylum is a very interesting thing, Arup and Amit, is that when we talk about asylums here in the 19th century, especially in the 19th century, uh, then asylums become very interesting spaces where there is this intersection of uh, law is there, there's intersection of history, there's intersection of power, there's intersection of many things which are going along. So there is medicine also, right?
Hmm.
There's medicine also, there's psychiatry also, and they are in various spaces. So there are gender spaces also. For example, let me give you an example. So there were prisons in Assam. There were prisons in Assam. So let's talk about one asylum. So there were many asylums. There were native asylums and there were non-native asylums, right?
Okay.
So in the native asylums, like the Indians were there. Basically, for example, was one asylum. In the case of native asylums, it was this Tezpur asylum, which was a native asylum, where we see that such spaces like the space like we are talking about, that this idea of gaze is there. So there is this prison, and near the prison or within the vicinity of the prison, sometimes within the prison, there was a space which was meant out for these asylums. So asylums developed near prisons, and these asylums were closely watched by the army, they were closely watched by the police. So there were jailers also, and in between there were doctors also, right? So many a times the superintendents they doubled up as they were both administrators, prison administrators, as well as many a times they were also doctors, professional doctors or psychiatrists. So what we
Mhm.
see is a very interesting hybrid kind of space. Which developed eventually in the 19th and the 20th century asylums. Like Tezpur is one important example. So and there were experiments which were going on, anthropological experiments, as you argued, and then in the case of Andamans, also what we see is anthropological experiments were happening, and there were botany experiments that were also happening simultaneously. So there were many species which were being zoological species that were being discovered in the late 19th century. So many times you'll find many articles in Lancet and other medical journals also regarding this. Amit?
Yeah, it's very interesting. From my knowledge of 19th century, which is largely the newspapers, because my research was in John Lang, is that there is deep interest in phrenology, which is one of the most vicious 19th century anthropological experiments, let us say. Because as you would understand, the study of skulls was interesting. So, this was the bulwark of social Darwinism by differentiating between men and women, whites and blacks. That's simple. But the most interesting skulls were obviously of two kinds of people: geniuses and criminals. So we see this spill over into 20th century as well, where famous musicians' bodies are exhumed from their graves and so on. But the phrenological route is very interesting. It is one of the most globalized routes. It starts in Tasmania because most of the convicts, the prisoners from England who were sent to do hard work in Australia, they would run away and be imprisoned again. And most of these people, you would understand, were spoon thieves or lace thieves who were sentenced to death. And then it was commuted to hard labor in Australia. There they would run away again and be imprisoned. So their skulls would be transported from Tasmania to mainland Australia, to India, to London, to Philadelphia, where Philip Morton was the, let's say, the head of the gang of doctors who controlled this entire business of phrenology. So as the skull would be traded from Tasmania, it would start at $10, and then stories would be added on. So one thief, this guy would turn to be a cannibal, and there would be a story of how he ran away from the prison and ate his fellow inmate, and he was found with a hand. And then the story would grow and grow till he became, a cannibal and animal eater and everything else, till the skull reached Philadelphia, and the price would increase accordingly from $10 to in the end $10,000 also in the middle of 19th century. So it was fascinating how there's a lot of concoction storytelling along with what was considered high science at that time, and it turns out to be a complete pseudoscience. So that's one aspect of these criminals. The other interest was in tribals of Polynesia, what their skulls look like, because it was known that they are ancient civilizations predating all the sort of civilizations that we knew of. Now we know Australia is around 30,000 to 50,000 years old, the Aboriginal people. So all these islands nearby, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, and so on, these were depopulated. The people were kidnapped and killed for their skulls during this period, and again traded across the same route, India and London and Philadelphia and so on. So you also see a great euphoria amongst doctors of London. They wanted the best criminals' skulls, so to say. And so there are various records of riots outside the prisons for the skulls, where the families would get into a serious fight with the doctors who would have paid the jailer a certain sum for the skull of a hanged man. So all these very interesting stories from the 19th century, where prisoners were used for. And I think also a lot of this, it's my conjecture, this enterprise of thuggy or thug as we know, now we know that a lot of it is concocted, that it does not have roots in fact. But a lot of it may have been manufactured by the British to obtain the skulls of interesting so-called notified tribes or criminals who they were interested in.
There are two things like I would like to bring over here. So one is the idea of criminal tribes here, and the second is this.
1875.
One is criminal tribes. Can you hear me?
1875. The legislation was brought to.
Yeah, 1871. Yeah. So
Yes.
one was criminal tribes. One was this idea of criminal tribes, and the other was this. Because we are talking about eugenics, we are talking about phrenology, and we are talking about skulls. So we have to talk about this school called the positive school in criminology, wherein there is this person known as Cesare Lombroso. So he talks about the idea that they were born criminals. The criminals were born. So criminals were those
Phrenology
people.
assumes that all the traits are there in you. You're a
Yeah.
genius, criminal parts of your skull. If it's too big, you're a criminal, and so on.
Yeah. So you have thick lips and you have long hands and you have a certain face cut. So you are a born criminal, apart from other traits. So this is one thing that I wanted to think about, and the other was this idea of criminal tribes. So criminal tribes is very central to what we are talking today. Like for example, we are talking about disciplining, we are talking about control, we are talking about spaces of control, we are talking about spaces of confinement. So here, when we talk about these things, obviously this particular thing emerges out, like. What to do with this why criminal tribes. So one thing about criminal tribes is like when you're talking about criminal tribes, you're basically talking about control. You're talking about disciplining the Indian population. So 1871, this law, as we all know, comes out. This criminal tribes thing comes out, and there were many communities, like for example the Sansi community, the Bavaria community, the Pardi community, and in the Western India there was the Kanjar community. So there were many tribes that were termed as criminal
Criminalized.
tribes. They were criminalized, and the point is, by this thing, like this idea of criminal tribes was basically rooted from these ideas that you are saying, pseudoscientific ideas like social Darwinism and European criminology, for that matter. This idea that hereditary criminals are there, born criminals are there. So when you, for example, in this act, like there would be a notification of tribes, wherein certain tribes will be deemed as criminal tribes. So there will be compulsory registration for members. They have to carry passes. There will be restriction on their movement. There will be surveillance and policing. There will be roll calls. There will be fingerprinting and monitoring by the police. And then it didn't go. And the other thing that I would like to place over here is that this act basically reflects what Foucault later on calls disciplinary power. So surveillance was constant, disciplinary power. So surveillance was constant and normalized. Control was just not operated through prisons, but through proper documentation, proper categorization, and restriction on mobility. So there were settlements also. Entire populations were turned into objects of control and knowledge, creation of knowledge.
Yeah.
So
It's also interesting to see how this has lingered on in pop culture, especially American pop culture, in Hollywood, with movies like Natural Born Killers, and there are many movies like this which assert that criminals are naturally born, and there's a whole
and even the series, even the series of it.
that. Which one?
A Netflix series, Orange is New Black, for example.
Yeah.
So Orange is New Black is another important prison series that talks about this. Again, it's a setting, and the thing is, like, it's a gender comes in, and we see that there are guards, there are inmates, there are female inmates, and it also talks about architecture is not important. What is more important now is social dynamics. So unlike the architecture as envisaged by, as thought by Jeremy Bentham, what we see over here is that in this new interpretation, social dynamics are more important. So surveillance exists, but power is very, very informal. So there are guards, there are inmate hierarchies. For example, even in Cellular Jail also, Arup, as you will remember, that there used to be the inmates used to act as guards. They were called Tindals, Tindals, Tindals. And this series, Orange is New Black, basically shows how inmates internalize discipline. So, what do you think, Arup?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Amit's point about Tasmanian skulls. The same thing was happening in the Andamans, and that's exactly why I'd asked that question. I didn't. Uh, I may have heard about this story from Amit, but maybe too many years ago for me to immediately remember. But Andamanese skulls were themselves being sent to the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, Amit, the same
Hmm.
library of
Yeah.
mortals. And
Hmm.
in the late 19th century, two British anthropologists, this was Edward Horace Mann and Maurice Vidal Portman, they had already disrupted the theory that the Andamanese were cannibals, that they used poisoned arrows, that they were born criminals, and all the associated theories. Because as you get more information, you sort of start busting the mythologies that the colonials had spun for all these years.
The only known cannibals were surely only the white people on ships who ran out of steam.
Yeah. So anyway, it was so interesting to see those parallels between Australia and Andamans. By the way, do you remember
Actually,
Magwitch?
everywhere, like I
Great
said,
Expectations.
the
Magwitch was sent to Australia
huh?
from Great Expectations. You remember the character
Yeah,
of Magwitch? So,
Yeah.
yeah,
so
yeah.
he was sent to the penal, the convict colony of Australia.
Talking of Australia, once again, I'll have to bring John Lang, who is poor guy was imprisoned two times, once in Calcutta and once in Vienna. So very briefly, I won't go into the details of the case. He won the case of Lala Jyoti Prasad and got him 36 lakhs rupees against the East India Company. And the interesting thing about him was that he fought cases only of Indians against the East India Company. So the British were determined to teach him a lesson, and they found a case of libel um, against one Colonel MacTeer, who was part of the jury, and Lang had said in the court that this man is a coward. And he had proved also how he was a coward. That in 1824, in a war in Kota, this Colonel MacTeer had run away, and now he was in the jury and so on. So he was jailed for libel 4 months in Calcutta, from where he ran a newspaper. So that's the important part, that at least white prisoners had rights like that they could not just read, but they could also write and disseminate their views in public as editor of a newspaper. So that's very interesting, what kind of rights prisoners have and which kind of prisoners have what kind of rights in the 19th century. In Vienna, of course, he was suspected to be a spy. He was writing in code words the things about his newspaper in Telegram, and that was all considered that he was a spy. So he was jailed there also for a few days. But it's interesting that this man took on the establishment head on in all his three careers: as a lawyer, as a journalist, as a writer, and he collected gossip from military wives and sold it back to the military and made a lot of money, and was only jailed twice. So that's good in terms of a career record, I think.
But Nasir, it was great to hear you, Professor Khan, because
Answer.
you sort of yes, Khan sir has sort of created a bridge, which is not very intuitive. It's slightly counterintuitive because between the 19th century and the current day, prisons also serve a capitalist purpose besides the carceral purpose. So you have been, Nasir, you've sort of opened our eyes to how prisons were, even back in the 19th century, also capitalist enterprise. They
Yeah,
were also collecting information and data.
yeah, Arup, yeah, when you are bringing the economic angle, so time and again, for example, in the case of Andamans and in the case of other jails also, this particular there is this obsession of not obsession is not the right word. Like the colonial administrators are always interested in finances, and they wanted to make this space. basically in the 19th century and in the 20th century, Andamans as more economically viable. Like, for example, they wanted more money to come from, and they were talking about the utility of
Right.
continuing this penal settlement. Why to continue this? So they were often asked questions: why should we involve ourselves into this penal settlement? Why should we have so much costs that are piling up? So economic viability was a very important question. So you're right, capitalism does plays a
Hey,
does play
Khan,
a
sir,
very
I have a
important.
question.
Yeah.
Being a historian, why were Bahadur Shah Zafar and Wajid Ali Shah transported? One to Rangoon, one to Calcutta.
Yeah.
Why?
So why were they transported?
Why weren't they killed? Then what was the need to imprison them? Their sons, Bahadur Shah Zafar's sons were killed right away. But why were these two figureheads then imprisoned in faraway lands?
Yeah. So this is a very interesting question. The again, it is conjuncture. It is like why did this happen? So one explanation I would like I'm not talking about Bahadur Shah Zafar. Uh, I won't be talking about Bahadur Shah Zafar. I won't be talking about the Mughals, but because I'm basically focused more on modern, as you know, Amit. But one is Bahadur Shah Zafar. The other, who was the other figure that you were talking about?
Wajid Ali Shah.
Wajid Ali Shah. Okay. So when we talk of I'm not, I have no idea about Wajid Ali Shah in detail. But when we talk of Bahadur Shah Zafar, then what I think in the course of 19th century and transportation especially. So let me think with this. Like I'm bringing one example. There was this Raja of Puri, if you remember, Amit,
Yeah.
because you've been to Orissa. So there was this Raja of Puri who was like convicted in a murder case. I don't remember his exact name in the second half of the 19th century. And he went to Andamans and he served in Andamans as a prison inmate. So the thing was that he was accused of killing the Pandit, uh, killing
Priest.
the, what do you
Priest.
say, Mahant, yeah,
Hmm.
Mm.
priest over there. And then he was like transported to Andamans. So the point is, why did they do that? So how would we answer? So one answer would be like obviously, uh, in the case of Raja of Puri, because I won't be talking about Bahadur Shah Zafar. In the case of the
Mm.
Raja of Puri, they were removing Raja of Puri from the site. So probably they from the site, as in like from Puri, and they were placing him in Andamans where he was completely irrelevant. And there are many scholars and many administrative writers and many narrative writers who talk about this poor fellow, this great Raja who was being reduced to a almost a madman and
So why
like a
not
normal
hang them?
prisoner.
My
Uh,
question is, why not hang these people? Is it because there's some sort of movement in Europe against death sentences by this time, or
No,
what is the reason?
Zafar's sons were hanged openly on,
Yeah, they were
you
killed
know.
right away, Kuni
They were,
Darwaza. But he was himself was transported. So is this some kind of um, uh, demonstration of justice by the state that we are not that cruel as you think us to be?
this could be, but apart from that, this could be one thing. But I also think that there was this question of legitimacy also, political legitimacy also. For example, like I'm just thinking in the case of Bahadur Shah Zafar, he had this political legitimacy. He was the Mughal emperor. He was the like now we think of him as the last Mughal emperor. So in the
Mm.
case of Raja of Puri also, he was a Raja, right? So probably they did not want to play with this question of legitimacy, political legitimacy, because questioning political legitimacy
Or they
would
did not want to be like the French and kill kings and queens. The British wanted to show they were more civilized than the French.
maybe,
hmm,
why not?
hmm.
Hmm.
So this I think is one. But that's why they did not kill the Raja of Puri. They did not hang the Raja of Puri for
Right.
killing one person. They could have easily hanged him. They couldn't have like they wouldn't have transferred him to transported him to Andamans. Same with
Right.
Bahadur Shah Zafar. अच्छा होता they could have hanged him properly, as in like properly hanged him, but they didn't do that.
That's too much Schadenfreude, Nasir. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed listening to us today, and I hope you join us soon. And thank you so much, Amit, Dr. Amit Ranjan. Thank you so much, Nasir. Thank you so much. Your new name. I hope that
Thank
sits
you,
well.
Professor. Professor Chatterjee. Thank you, Khan sir.
Professor Khan, sir, thank you for joining. And dear audience, until next time.
Thank you, Arup. Thank you, Amit.